Now, ordinarily we were going to go to Catherine Forster, who is in Nadine Dorris's old patch of mid-beds, having a bit of a problem with the line there. So I'm hoping that we do have on the line Treasury Minister Gareth Davies, who I think is joining me remotely. Gareth, are you there? Can you hear me? Hello, Mr Davies. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Thank you for bringing your interview a little bit forward so we could chat to you about the economic picture. Look, you must be delighted by these ONS figures, giving a much more positive view of the British economy. But, of course, the inevitable question is going to be asked, why don't you cut taxes then?
Well, great to be with you and thanks for having me on. I think you're right. This is really positive news that the ONS have uplifted the figures for GDP, showing that the UK grew faster out of the pandemic than any country in Europe. Obviously, this is a revision and we welcome that, but we're focused on the future. And that's why we're bearing down on inflation, we're investing in our economy and ensuring that we can stimulate more business investment. We are very clear that the number one priority, as I say, is bearing down on inflation, because that's the biggest tax that we can cut. It affects every single person in this country, every business. Everybody's struggling with it. We've got to tackle that first. And of course, we want to bring down taxes eventually, but it doesn't come, before sound money.
But isn't it a major problem for a Tory government that the taxpayer doesn't think they're getting good value for money? They're being burdened with the highest taxes since the Second World War. And at the same time, we've got polling carried out by Lord Ashcroft, who's obviously got links to the Conservative Party, in the Mail on Sunday. And when asked whether they think public services have declined in the last decade, so that's completely under Tory rule, 75% say yes. That's a damning indictment of conservatism, isn't it, over the past decade?
Well, I think the figures show that public services have performed well. I think we all remember the service that the NHS provided us through the pandemic. It was second to none. Education standards have increased significantly since 2010. And on taxes, we've brought about 3 million people out of tax altogether by increasing the thresholds. We still have the lowest corporation tax in the G7, and we've got one of the most generous tax allowances, corporate tax allowances in the OECD. So it's on us, actually, Camilla, to go on shows like this and communicate what we've done, the success that we've achieved.
But let's communicate honestly, please, Minister, because at the same time we've got 7.5 people on NHS waiting lists. We've got a National Audit Office report which has found that 700,000 school pupils may be learning in a building that is crumbling. So it's not going particularly well. What are you going to do about these crumbling schools? Why won't you produce a comprehensive list so that parents can know whether their children are studying in a safe environment and that the roof isn't going to cave in on them?
Well, protecting children and staff in schools is obviously a paramount priority, and that's why the Education Secretary has acted so swiftly on new evidence that has emerged during the summer and as recent as last week. We have been very proactively engaged on this for the past few years. Every one of the 22,500 schools has been surveyed and sent questionnaires to determine where RAAC exists. That has determined that 156 schools out of the 22,500 have confirmed RAAC. 52 of those action has already been taken and mitigation has already been actioned. 104, we've now decided that we advise the bodies responsible for those institutions to vacate while mitigations can take place. So obviously this is incredibly serious, it's very concerning, but most people in this country will not be affected by this. Parents will be told by their schools first and foremost whether they're impacted. If parents watching this have not heard from their schools by the opening of schools, they should proceed to the school as normal. That's been our priority. The Education Secretary will be making a statement, though, later this week in the House of Commons.
And yet we hear from an investigation by Schools Week that the government knew that this was a problem back in 2018. So why have you been so late to act? Why are we now in a situation where parents are not able to send their children into school this week because their classrooms aren't safe?
Well, like I said, the vast majority of schools will not be impacted. Even where they have confirmed cases of RAAC, it is unlikely that schools will have to close, although inevitably some will. This could be as small as a one room, by the way. It could be a boiler room in an outbuilding. We're taking it on a case-by-case building. So it's not the case that all face-to-face lessons will be cancelled. That's not the case, and we're providing financial support to ensure that mitigations are in place. In terms of when we knew what, this is obviously material that was installed in the 1960s and 80s, and from the 1990s, successive governments have known about the risk and have managed those risks. In that time, experts have evolved their advice. In 2018, we've issued guidance to schools to say that they should have contingency measures in place for short notice vacation if they have RAAC. In 2022, we surveyed 22,500 schools to determine where that RAAC was, and we've acted on that immediately. This is in contrast, by the way, to most countries around the world, but including Labour-run Wales, who have failed to do this. They've failed to survey their schools to determine where RAAC exists, and so they're going to have to catch up very quickly with what we've been doing in England, and that's a really important point to make.
Well, having said that, Mr Davies, why then, if you're so well prepared and you're ahead of this curve, are you announcing this 2 days before schools start? What on earth do you expect parents to do with regard to childcare? And equally, wouldn't you be quite worried with the kind of opaqueness around this list, this mystical list that the government seems unlikely to ever publish? If you've got children at a state school, and there's now also talk, by the way, about an asbestos problem. We've got another story in the Mail on Sunday about a hospital in Cambridgeshire which is having to prop up the ceiling. You'd be worried sending infants into that environment, wouldn't you?
Of course, as a parent, you want to know that your children are safe. And as I say, the vast majority of schools will not be impacted by this. Those that are impacted, it will likely not lead to the school being closed. There will be mitigations in place to maintain face-to-face lessons. In terms of why now, obviously, you know, a few days before the opening of term, that is not something we would have chosen. This is based on very new advice as late as last week, where previously determined non-critical, in the words of a surveyor, non-critical RAAC existence has failed. And on that basis, we changed the advice to those bodies that are responsible, local authorities and academy trusts who are responsible for building maintenance. Our advice changed out of an abundance of caution, because children are involved, to say, you know what, let's vacate any case where RAAC exists so that we can get the surveyors in, determine how safe they are, have a case-by-case risk assessment. Most will not be impacted at all in this country, but it is absolutely right that we do this, as inconvenient as it is. And by the way, if this happened during term time, we would make exactly the same decision. So it is incredibly inconvenient, but hopefully parents can understand that while most are not impacted, those that are, it is inconvenient, but we're putting safety first.
Let's go back to economic matters, obviously, because that's your brief. Now, we've heard from Chancellor Jeremy Hunt saying that he's basically ruled out cutting taxes before the end of the year, so we're not to expect anything in the autumn statement. We then have Michael Gove, your colleague, talking about how the government should shift the burden from income to wealth. Is he freelancing? Is he onto something there?
Well, Michael is one of our most respected and experienced cabinet ministers, but I would just point out that we have a very progressive tax system in this country. I think the top 5% of earners pay about 50% of the tax revenue, and this is in line with most G7 countries. In terms of broader taxation, obviously we want taxes to come down, but as I say, we stick to our principles that you've got to put sound money first. When debt is rising significantly on the back of a pandemic and energy crisis, we've got to pay that down. There's no point borrowing to cut taxes when we're paying significant amount of interest. Obviously, as Conservatives, we want to get taxes down. I would just point out that even when taxes have increased, such as the corporation tax rise, it's still the lowest in the G7. And we've put in place mitigations such as tax allowances, so that the effective tax rate that businesses pay is still very competitive on the international stage. Yet
at the same time, that polling by Ashcroft, when the public is asked who they associate with low taxes, they don't say the Tories anymore, they say Labour.
Well, we accept that taxes are higher than we want them to be. We want taxes to come down, but let's be clear about things. They're only going to go one way under Labour. They have made a significant amount, multi-billions of pounds of commitments of spending. Where are they going to get that from? They're going to have to raise taxes if they enter Downing Street at the next election.
So you're comfortable having lost your low tax Tory status?
I would argue that we are still low tax and internationally competitive, but we are always looking at ways of bringing it down. But we are the party of responsible, sustainable finances first. Well, you can trust us with your taxpayer money not to be paying too much debt interest at the expense of something else. Well,
you say about being internationally competitive. I, funnily enough, was travelling through Rome Airport yesterday and I was able to cash in on the fact that, of course, now we're out of the EU, I can buy duty-free shopping at the airport. And I may or may not have purchased something for myself on my way back to the GB News studio. Now, of course, if you're shopping in London, you can't benefit from duty-free shopping, which is a disaster for businesses in London, isn't it?
Well, we keep all taxes under review, as you would expect, but in that particular case, the evidence that we've seen is that it has actually a minimal impact on sales in London. You just have to walk around London this summer to see how many tourists that we have. It is thriving. So we keep all taxes under review.
All right, Gareth Davies, thank you very much for joining me.